sometimes the hardest thing in life is realizing that the only thing standing between where you are and where you want to be is the decision to step up. Not luck, not timing, not talent, just you, right now, deciding that you're done waiting. And that realization feels heavy because it removes every excuse you've been holding on to. It puts everything back in your hands. But at the same time, it gives you something most people never fully accept: control. Most people don't fail because they lack ability. They fail because they move like someone who doesn't believe they belong at the level they're chasing. They hesitate, they shrink, they wait for confidence before they act. But the Stoics understood something deeper. Epictetus taught that we don't control what happens, only how we respond. If something in you recognizes that truth, then you're already closer than you think. Not because anything around you has changed, but because you're starting to see clearly. And once that clarity is there, the only thing left is to act on it. Not once, not when it feels easy, but consistently, quietly, with intention. Think about how most people live. They wait, not once or twice, but constantly, as if waiting has become their default state. They wait until they feel confident, until they feel worthy, until the timing finally feels right. And while they're waiting, life keeps moving. Opportunities don't pause. Growth doesn't slow down. Time doesn't adjust itself to uncertainty. So something subtle begins to happen. Days turn into months, months into years, and the version of themselves they once imagined slowly becomes distant. Something they think about, but never become. And the dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like failure. It feels like patience. It feels responsible, like they're preparing. But almost ready is one of the most deceptive states you can live in. It keeps you close enough to progress to feel comfortable, but far enough from action that nothing actually changes. And over time, that gap between intention and action becomes your identity. Confidence doesn't work the way most people think it does. It's not something you find, it's something you build. Through action, through repetition, through showing up before you feel ready. The more you act with intention, the more evidence you create for yourself. And that evidence slowly replaces doubt. Not instantly, but steadily. When you start acting as if you are already operating at your highest level, not in arrogance, not in comparison, but through quiet discipline, something shifts. You carry yourself differently. Your decisions become clearer. You stop asking for permission in places where you never needed it. And instead of shrinking in moments of pressure, you begin to meet them with control, not because fear disappears, it doesn't, but because it stops leading. Your actions are no longer dictated by how you feel in the moment. They're guided by who you've decided to be. And that creates a new baseline, one that doesn't fluctuate based on mood or circumstance, but stays consistent because it's rooted in identity. That idea has been understood for a long time. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." There's a simplicity to that, but also a level of clarity most people avoid. It doesn't suggest waiting until you become something. It suggests deciding first, clearly, and then aligning your actions with that decision. Identity comes before behavior, and once that identity is set, your actions begin to follow. You start noticing it in small ways. The way you handle conversations changes. You become more present, less concerned with how you're being perceived. Your focus sharpens because you're no longer dividing your attention between action and doubt. Even the way you approach challenges shifts. Instead of asking whether you're capable, you start asking what needs to be done, and then you move. And that movement, repeated over time, builds something that can't be faked. A quiet certainty, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, grounded, real. And as that certainty grows, something else happens. You stop needing validation. Not completely, but enough that it no longer controls you. You're not looking for approval in every step or reassurance in every decision. That doesn't mean you ignore feedback. It means your direction is no longer dependent on it. You become anchored in your own standard. And that anchor creates stability, especially in moments where most people hesitate. The more you act in alignment with that standard, the more natural it becomes. What once felt forced begins to feel familiar. What once required effort becomes automatic, not because it's easy, but because it's consistent. Repetition removes resistance, familiarity removes doubt, and over time you stop thinking about acting like the best version of yourself. You simply operate that way. That's why waiting is so costly. Not just because of lost time, but because of what it reinforces. Every time you wait for confidence before acting, you strengthen the belief that you need permission. But every time you act first, even in small ways, you weaken that belief. You prove to yourself that action doesn't require perfect conditions. It requires a decision. And once that decision is made, everything begins to align. Not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. And that steady alignment is what builds momentum. It's what closes the gap between where you are and who you're becoming. Because in the end, you don't become the best by waiting. You become it by acting like it. Until one day there's no difference between who you are and how you move. And if this way of thinking resonates with you, then don't treat it as something you just listen to and move on from. Stay with it. Let it shape how you think, how you act, how you show up. Because growth doesn't come from hearing ideas. It comes from returning to them and living them. And if you're choosing to stay on that path, then consider subscribing as a step toward reinforcing the kind of mindset you're building. The shift is not about becoming someone new overnight. It's about choosing a standard and living by it, even when it feels unfamiliar. It's about recognizing that confidence is not a prerequisite for action, but a byproduct of it. And most importantly, it's about understanding that the version of you you're aiming for is not as far away as it seems. It's built through the choices you make right now, in moments that feel small, but carry more weight than you realize. And maybe there's a part of you pushing back against all of this, quietly saying, "But I'm not the best." That thought feels honest. It feels grounded. It even feels rational. And that's exactly why it stops so many people before they ever begin. Because the moment you define yourself by where you currently are, you lock yourself into that position. You treat identity like something that must be earned first, proven over time, confirmed by results. And until that proof shows up, you hold yourself back. You hesitate. You move carefully, as if you're waiting for permission from reality to finally see yourself differently. But that way of thinking has it backwards. Identity isn't something you arrive at after the work is done. It's something you choose before the work even begins. The standard you set for yourself determines how you act long before results ever appear. And when you delay that decision, you delay everything that comes with it. Because if you don't see yourself as someone who operates at a high level, your actions will always reflect that. Not because you lack ability, but because your behavior is aligning with a lower standard that you've accepted without even realizing it. That's where the shift starts to deepen. Being the best isn't about your current level. It's not about where you rank compared to others. It's about the standard you hold yourself to in moments where no one is watching. It's about the way you approach your effort, your discipline, your mindset, even when there's no immediate reward attached to it. When you decide to act like the best, you're not making a claim about perfection. You're making a commitment to responsibility. Responsibility for how you show up, how you respond, and how you carry yourself regardless of circumstance. And once that standard is set, something interesting begins to happen. Your behavior starts to align with it, almost automatically. You don't have to force every decision or overthink every move. There's a quiet filter in place now. You start asking yourself, even without words, is this what the best version of me would do? And that question alone begins to shape your actions. You start choosing differently. You become more intentional, Not because someone is telling you to, but because you've chosen a higher baseline for yourself. At first it feels like effort. There's resistance. Old habits don't disappear overnight. The part of you that's used to hesitation, comfort, and second-guessing doesn't just fade away. It pushes back. It questions your decisions. It tries to pull you back into familiar patterns. But this is where most people misunderstand growth. They think resistance means something is wrong. In reality, resistance is often a sign that something is changing, that you're stepping outside of a pattern that no longer serves you. Over time, the effort begins to shift. What once felt forced starts to feel natural, not because the actions themselves become easier, but because your identity starts to catch up with your behavior. You begin to see yourself differently, and that shift in perception reinforces everything else. It becomes a loop. Your actions shape your identity, and your identity shapes your actions. The two begin to work together instead of against each other. This is where responsibility becomes power. Because once you accept that your standard determines your behavior, you realize that you're not stuck. You're not waiting on external conditions to change. You're not dependent on someone else recognizing your value before you can act on it. You have control over how you show up right now in this moment. And that control, when used consistently, becomes momentum. The Stoics spoke about this kind of alignment in a way that still feels relevant today. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." There's no delay in that statement, no waiting period, no requirement to first feel ready or qualified. It points directly to action, to embodiment, to the idea that clarity doesn't come from thinking about who you should be, but from becoming that person through what you do. And when you take that seriously, everything simplifies. You stop getting caught in endless reflection about whether you're good enough, prepared enough, or capable enough. Those questions lose their importance because they no longer determine your actions. Instead, your actions begin to define the answer. Every time you show up with discipline, you reinforce the idea that you are disciplined. Every time you follow through, you reinforce reliability. Every time you choose growth over comfort, you reinforce strength. It's not about proving something to the world. It's about proving something to yourself, quietly and consistently. And that kind of proof doesn't need validation. It doesn't rely on recognition. It builds internally, layer by layer, until it becomes undeniable. Not because you've reached some final level, but because you've established a pattern that you can trust. That trust changes how you move. It removes hesitation. It replaces doubt with direction. And even when you face setbacks, it doesn't shake you the way it used to, because your identity is no longer tied to a single outcome. It's tied to a standard you've committed to, a way of operating that remains steady even when circumstances shift. So when that thought comes up again, "I'm not the best," it no longer carries the same weight. It becomes irrelevant, because you're no longer waiting to become something before you act. You're acting in a way that makes becoming inevitable. Look closely at how people perform under pressure. Strip everything else away, and you start to see something most people overlook. It's rarely just skill. It's rarely just experience. Two people can walk into the same situation with similar abilities, similar preparation, and yet perform in completely different ways. One hesitates, overthinks, second guesses every move. The other moves with clarity, makes decisions quickly, and carries a sense of control that seems almost natural. And when you look deeper, the difference isn't technical, it's internal, it's belief. The person who walks into a room believing they belong there carries themselves differently before they even say a word. Their posture reflects certainty. Their presence feels grounded. They don't rush to prove themselves because they're not questioning their place to begin with. And that changes how everything unfolds. They speak more clearly because they're not filtering every thought through self-doubt. They act more decisively because they're not waiting for internal approval. It's not that they don't feel pressure, they do, but pressure doesn't distort them the way it distorts someone who hasn't decided who they are yet. On the other side, the person who doesn't believe they belong moves in a completely different rhythm. Even if they have the same knowledge, the same preparation, something holds them back. They hesitate before speaking. They replay their words in their head before saying them. They question their instincts instead of trusting them. And that hesitation creates friction. It slows everything down. It breaks the flow. And over time, that hesitation compounds into outcomes that reinforce their original doubt. This is where things become almost ironic. Because belief, something intangible, something internal, begins to shape results in a very real, external way. The one who believes they belong ends up performing better, not because they were initially more capable, but because their belief allowed them to use their ability fully. The one who doubts themselves ends up underperforming, not because they lacked skill, but because their doubt limited their access to it. That's the part most people don't realize. Ability doesn't disappear under pressure. It gets blocked. It gets buried under layers of hesitation, overthinking, and self-questioning. And those layers are built from belief, from the story you tell yourself about who you are in that moment. If that story is uncertain, your actions will reflect it. If that story is grounded, your actions will follow. And this is where the shift becomes uncomfortable for a lot of people, because it raises a question that's hard to ignore. Are you waiting for results to believe in yourself, or are you willing to believe first and let the results follow? Most people choose the first path. It feels safer. It feels logical. I'll believe in myself once I prove something. But the problem with that approach is that the proof they're waiting for often depends on the belief they don't yet have. So they stay stuck in a loop. They wait for results to build confidence, but they need confidence to produce results. And without breaking that cycle, nothing changes. They stay in the same pattern, repeating the same behaviors, getting the same outcomes, and reinforcing the same beliefs. It becomes self-confirming, not because it's true, but because it's consistent. Breaking that cycle requires a different approach. It requires deciding to believe before you have the evidence. Not blindly, not arrogantly, but deliberately. Choosing to act as if you belong, even if part of you still feels uncertain. Because that decision changes how you show up. It changes how you think, how you speak, how you move. And those changes begin to create new outcomes. At first, those outcomes might be small, subtle shifts, slight improvements, but they matter because they start to build a new kind of evidence that supports a different identity, and as that evidence grows, the belief that once felt forced begins to feel real. Not because you convinced yourself with words, but because you reinforced it with action. This is something that has been understood for a long time, even if it's often ignored in practice. Carl Jung once observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That applies directly here, because the beliefs you carry about yourself, especially the ones you haven't fully examined, quietly shape how you act under pressure. They influence your decisions before you even realize it. And if those beliefs are rooted in doubt, they will continue to limit you until you bring them into awareness and choose something different. Once you start doing that, something begins to shift internally. You become more aware of the moments where you would normally hesitate. You start catching those patterns in real time, and instead of following them automatically, you pause and you choose differently. You act in alignment with the person you've decided to be, not the person your old habits are trying to keep you as. That doesn't eliminate pressure. Pressure is still there, but it stops controlling you. It becomes something you can move through instead of something that dictates your behavior. And that changes everything, because now your performance is no longer limited by your initial emotional state. It's guided by your standard. And that standard, once established, begins to stabilize your actions across different situations. Whether you're in a familiar environment or a challenging one, you show up in a similar way, not perfectly, but consistently. And that consistency is what builds trust in yourself. It's what allows you to rely on your own behavior, even when circumstances are uncertain. Over time, that reliability becomes your foundation. You stop questioning whether you'll show up the right way because you've done it enough times to know that you will. And that knowledge creates a different kind of confidence, not loud, not exaggerated, but steady, quiet, unshakable. And it all started with a decision, not a result, not external validation. Just a decision to believe first and let everything else follow. The Stoics would look at all of this and strip it down to something simple, almost uncomfortable in how direct it is. What you control is yours. What you don't is not. Your thoughts, your actions, your standards, those belong to you completely. And once you really understand that, not just intellectually, but in how you live, the entire game changes. Because now the focus shifts inward, not in a passive way, but in a deliberate, disciplined way. You stop measuring yourself against everyone around you and start measuring yourself against something far more demanding, your own potential. That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. Because when your attention is constantly on others, your standards become unstable. They rise and fall depending on who you're comparing yourself to. You feel confident one moment, uncertain the next. You feel ahead, then suddenly behind. And that cycle keeps you reactive. It keeps you chasing something external, something that never really settles. But when you turn that focus inward, something stabilizes. You're no longer asking where you stand in relation to others. You're asking whether you're living up to what you know you're capable of. And that question is harder to avoid. Because deep down, most people know when they're holding back. They know when they're choosing comfort over growth, hesitation over action. It's not always obvious on the surface, but it's there. A quiet awareness that they could be doing more, showing up better, pushing further. And yet, instead of confronting that directly, they soften it with comparison. They look around and tell themselves they're doing fine because others are doing less. And in that moment, the standard drops. Not because they can't rise higher, but because they've chosen not to. This is where imagined inferiority starts to take hold, not always in a loud or dramatic way, but in small, consistent thoughts that shape behavior over time. The belief that someone else is naturally better, that others are more capable, more deserving, more prepared. And those beliefs, even when they're not fully conscious, begin to influence how you act. You hesitate more, you speak less, you second-guess decisions you would otherwise trust, and over time, that hesitation becomes part of your identity. But what's important to understand is that much of this exists in your own perception. It's constructed internally, reinforced through repetition, and rarely challenged directly. Seneca captured this clearly when he wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That imagined gap between you and others, that sense of being behind or not enough, often has more influence over your behavior than actual limitations. It shapes your actions in ways that quietly hold you back, not because you're incapable, but because you've accepted a version of yourself that isn't accurate. So what happens when you stop entertaining that idea altogether, not partially, not occasionally, but fully? What happens when you decide that you are no longer going to carry the assumption that someone else is inherently above you, not in ego, not in arrogance, but in standard? You stop placing others on a pedestal and start placing responsibility on yourself. You stop shrinking in spaces where you belong. You stop filtering your actions through doubt, and instead, you begin to operate from a position of internal equality, where your focus is no longer on where you rank, but on how you show up. That shift removes a lot of unnecessary weight, because comparison, especially the kind rooted in insecurity, drains energy. It splits your attention. Part of you is focused on the task in front of you, and another part is focused on how you measure up. And that division weakens your performance. It creates hesitation where there could be clarity, but when you remove that layer, your attention becomes sharper, more direct, more effective. And with that clarity comes a different kind of discipline, not one based on pressure or fear, but one based on alignment. You start acting in ways that reflect your potential, not your doubts. You follow through because that's the standard you've set. You push yourself because you know you can. And when you fall short, you don't collapse into self-criticism or comparison. You adjust. You refine. You keep moving. This is what it means to compete with your own potential. It's not about being better than someone else. It's about not settling for less than what you're capable of. And that kind of competition is ongoing. It doesn't end. It evolves. Because as you grow, your understanding of what you're capable of grows with you. The standard rises, the expectations deepen, and your actions begin to reflect that progression. Over time, this becomes your focus, not external validation, not comparison, just alignment between who you are and who you know you can be. And that alignment creates a kind of stability that external measures can't provide. You're not shaken by someone else's success. You're not discouraged by someone else's progress. Because your direction is your own. Your standard is your own. And that's where real confidence begins to take shape. Not in moments of recognition or praise, but in quiet consistency. In the way you show up when no one is watching. In the way you handle challenges without needing reassurance. In the way you continue moving forward, even when progress feels slow. Because once you stop entertaining the idea that you're less than, you stop acting like it. And when your actions change, everything else begins to follow. At first, it's going to feel off. Not just slightly unfamiliar, but genuinely uncomfortable in a way that makes you question what you're doing. You'll feel like you're stepping into something that doesn't fully belong to you yet. Like you're trying on a version of yourself that hasn't settled in. And that discomfort can be misleading, because it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like resistance. It feels like you're forcing something. But that's exactly what growth looks like in the beginning. It doesn't arrive as confidence, it arrives as friction. That friction shows up in simple moments. You speak a little more directly than you're used to, and immediately you notice it. You carry yourself with more intention, and it feels almost unnatural, like you're being watched even when you're not. You make a decision faster than you normally would, and part of you wonders if you rushed it. None of these moments are dramatic on their own, but together they create a sense that you're operating outside your comfort zone, and that's where most people pull back. They interpret that feeling as a sign that something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. In fact, that discomfort is a signal that something is changing. It means you're no longer operating from the same patterns that kept you in place before. It means you're stepping beyond what's familiar, and anything unfamiliar will feel uncertain at first. That's not a flaw in the process. That is the process. The problem is that most people are so used to comfort that they treat discomfort as a warning instead of a marker of progress. Think about it in physical terms. The first time you lift a weight that challenges you, it feels heavy. Your form isn't perfect. Your movements are slower. There's strain. But that doesn't mean you're not capable. It means you're developing. The same thing happens mentally and emotionally. When you begin acting as if you are the best version of yourself, you're lifting a different kind of weight. You're holding yourself to a higher standard, and at first, that standard feels heavy. The same applies to how you express yourself. The first time you speak with clarity instead of hesitation, your voice might feel uncertain. You might stumble slightly, not because you don't know what you're saying, but because you're not used to saying it with that level of certainty. And again, that's not failure. That's adjustment. You're recalibrating how you show up. You're building a new way of operating. Over time, repetition begins to change everything. What once felt forced starts to feel familiar. The actions you had to think about become automatic. You don't have to remind yourself to carry yourself differently or to make decisions with intention. It becomes part of how you move. And that shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually through consistent action. Small moments, repeated enough times, start to reshape your baseline. This is where patience becomes important, not the kind of patience that waits, but the kind that continues. Because there will be moments where it feels like nothing is changing. Moments where the discomfort is still there, where the old patterns try to resurface, where the new standard hasn't fully taken hold yet. And in those moments, it's easy to question whether it's working. But progress isn't always visible in real time. It builds beneath the surface before it shows externally. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. It's not about doing everything perfectly or pushing yourself to extremes. It's about showing up in alignment with your standard, again and again, even when it feels repetitive, even when it feels slow. Because each repetition reinforces the identity you're building. Each action adds another layer of evidence that this is who you are becoming. And eventually, something shifts. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost unnoticeable way. You realize that the things that once felt uncomfortable no longer feel that way. You're speaking more clearly without thinking about it. You're making decisions without overanalyzing. You're carrying yourself with a sense of certainty that doesn't feel forced anymore. It feels natural. And when that happens, you understand something important. It was never about becoming someone else. It was about practicing a version of yourself until it became real. This idea has been understood for a long time, even if it's often overlooked in practice. Aristotle expressed it simply: we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. That line captures the entire process, not as something abstract, but as something practical. Your identity is shaped by what you do consistently, not by what you intend or imagine. So when acting like the best feels strange, it's not evidence that you're pretending. It's evidence that you're early in the process. You're stepping into a standard that you haven't fully grown into yet, and that gap between where you are and where you're going is where the discomfort lives. But that gap closes with repetition, with consistency, with action that doesn't depend on how you feel in the moment. And once it closes, the thing that once felt unnatural becomes your default. Not because you forced it into place, but because you built it, one decision at a time. And then, almost without noticing exactly when it happened, something deeper begins to take place. The effort that once felt constant starts to fade into the background. You're no longer reminding yourself at every step to act differently, to think differently, to hold yourself to a higher standard. The reminders become quieter because they're no longer necessary. What used to require conscious effort begins to happen on its own. Not perfectly, not in every moment, but consistently enough that it feels like a shift rather than a struggle. At first you might catch it in small ways. A decision you would have overthought before now happens quickly, almost naturally. You choose discipline without negotiating with yourself. You move forward without the usual pause of hesitation, and afterward you realize you didn't have to push yourself to do it. It just happened. That moment is subtle, but it's important, because it shows you that something has changed beneath the surface. The identity you've been practicing is starting to settle in. This is where repetition begins to show its real value, not in the visible results, but in the internal rewiring that happens over time. Every time you acted in alignment with a higher version of yourself, even when it felt unnatural, you were reinforcing a pattern. And those patterns, repeated enough times, begin to form habits. Not just habits of behavior, but habits of thought. You start thinking differently without trying. You start seeing situations through a different lens, one that is less reactive and more intentional. What's interesting is that this shift doesn't feel dramatic. There's no single moment where everything changes at once. Instead, it feels like a quiet transition. You look back and realize that the things that used to challenge you don't have the same hold over you anymore. The hesitation that once slowed you down has less influence. The doubt that once dominated your thinking now feels distant, almost irrelevant. And in its place, there's a steadiness that wasn't there before. That steadiness shows up in how you handle pressure. Where you once would have questioned yourself, you now act with clarity, not because you're certain of every outcome, but because you trust your ability to respond. And that trust is built on repetition. It's built on showing up consistently, on making decisions aligned with your standard, even when it wasn't easy. Over time, those decisions create a foundation, and that foundation becomes something you can rely on. This is where discipline starts to feel different. It's no longer something you force yourself into. It becomes part of your default. You choose the harder option without needing to justify it. You follow through without needing external motivation. You act, not because you're trying to prove something, but because it aligns with who you are. And that shift from effort to identity is what changes everything. Because when something becomes part of your identity, it no longer requires constant attention. You don't need to think about being disciplined any more than you think about breathing. It's integrated. It's part of how you operate. And that integration frees up energy. You're no longer spending mental effort deciding whether to act in a certain way. The decision has already been made. It's built into who you are. There's a kind of quiet confidence that comes with that. Not the loud, performative kind, but something more stable. You trust yourself in a way that doesn't depend on how you feel in the moment. Even on days where motivation is low, your actions don't collapse. They stay aligned with your standard. And that consistency creates a sense of control, not over outcomes, but over your response to them. This idea has been reflected in Stoic thought for centuries. Epictetus put it simply, "No great thing is created suddenly. That includes identity. It's not something you adopt overnight. It's something you build through repeated action, through consistent alignment with the version of yourself you've chosen to become. And while the process might feel slow in the beginning, it compounds in ways that are hard to see until you've experienced them. As this process continues, you begin to notice that your choices are no longer driven by short-term comfort. You start prioritizing what aligns with your long-term standard. That doesn't mean you never feel resistance or that everything becomes easy. It means that resistance no longer dictates your behavior. You feel it, but you move through it. You acknowledge it, but you don't follow it. And that creates a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever feels good in the moment, but the freedom to act in alignment with who you've decided to be. The freedom to choose discipline without conflict, to choose clarity without hesitation, to choose action without waiting for the perfect emotional state. That freedom is built, not given, and it comes from consistency. At a certain point, the question of whether you're acting like the best stops being relevant, because there's no longer a gap between the act and the identity. You're not performing a role, you're living in alignment with it. The behaviors that once felt intentional become instinctive. The mindset that once required effort becomes your default, and that's when the shift is complete. Not because you've reached some final version of yourself, but because the process itself has become part of who you are. You're no longer trying to become the best. You're operating in a way that continuously moves you in that direction. And that movement is steady, grounded, and self-sustaining. It started as a decision, then it became a practice, and now it's who you are. But there's something important that can't be ignored if this is going to be real. Acting like the best version of yourself doesn't mean pretending your weaknesses don't exist. It doesn't mean covering them up with confidence or avoiding the parts of yourself that feel uncomfortable to look at. In fact, it requires the opposite. It requires a level of honesty that most people spend their lives avoiding. Because the moment you decide to hold yourself to a higher standard, you also remove the ability to lie to yourself about where you're falling short. And that's where things start to get difficult in a different way. Not physically, not even externally, internally, because it's one thing to act with confidence in situations where you feel strong. It's another thing entirely to look directly at your weaknesses without softening them, without justifying them, without turning away from them. Most people don't struggle because they don't know what needs to improve. They struggle because they don't want to fully face it. There's always a way to avoid it. You can distract yourself. You can compare yourself to someone doing worse. You can tell yourself that it's not the right time, that things will improve later, that you just need more motivation. And those thoughts feel reasonable. They feel harmless. But over time, they create a gap between who you are and who you could be. Not because you lack potential, but because you're protecting yourself from the discomfort of growth. But once you decide to act as if you are the best, that protection starts to fall away. Because you can't hold yourself to a high standard while ignoring the things that don't meet it. You can't claim discipline while avoiding the areas where you lack it. You can't claim clarity while ignoring the habits that keep you distracted. The standard forces you to confront those contradictions, not harshly, not with self-judgment, but with clarity. And clarity changes how you respond. Instead of avoiding your weaknesses, you begin to study them. You look at them as patterns, not as fixed traits. You start asking where they show up, how they affect your actions, and what triggers them. And once you understand them, they become something you can work with instead of something that controls you. You move from reacting to them to managing them, and that shift gives you a different kind of control. This is where growth becomes intentional, not random, not reactive, but deliberate. You're no longer waiting for improvement to happen on its own. You're identifying what needs to change and taking steps toward it, even when those steps are uncomfortable, especially when they are uncomfortable, because discomfort becomes part of the process, not something to avoid. There's a psychological depth to this that often goes unnoticed. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That idea cuts through a lot of surface-level thinking. It points directly to the fact that real growth doesn't come from focusing only on your strengths or trying to project a better image. It comes from confronting what you would rather ignore, bringing it into awareness, and working through it with intention. And that process isn't always comfortable. In fact, it rarely is, because facing your weaknesses means letting go of the stories you've used to protect yourself. It means admitting where you've been inconsistent, where you've avoided responsibility, where you've settled for less than what you're capable of. And that can feel heavy, but it's also where real change begins. Because once something is clear, it becomes actionable. You can't fix what you refuse to see. But the moment you see it clearly, without distortion, without excuses, you gain the ability to respond to it differently. You can adjust your behavior. You can build new habits. You can replace patterns that no longer serve you. And over time, those adjustments begin to reshape your baseline, just like everything else. What's important here is the mindset you bring into that process. This isn't about criticizing yourself or focusing on what's wrong. It's about taking ownership. It's about recognizing that your weaknesses are not permanent, but they are your responsibility. And that responsibility, when accepted fully, becomes a source of power instead of pressure. Because now, you're not waiting for change, you're creating it. And as you continue to act in alignment with that mindset, something shifts again. The weaknesses that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their weight. Not because they disappear instantly, but because you're no longer avoiding them. You're engaging with them, you're working through them. And that changes your relationship with them entirely. They stop being something that defines you and start becoming something that develops you. This is what separates surface-level improvement from real growth. It's not just about adding new habits or adopting a new mindset. It's about confronting the parts of yourself that resist change and working through them with consistency. It's about aligning your actions with your standards. even in areas where you're not yet strong. And that brings everything back to the central question, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. Are you willing to face yourself without excuses? Not once, not occasionally, but consistently. Because the answer to that question determines how far this process can go. If you avoid it, you stay where you are. You maintain the same patterns, the same limitations, the same results. But if you face it fully and honestly, you open the door to something different. You give yourself the chance to grow beyond what you've been, not by ignoring your flaws, but by working through them. And that's where the real strength is built. Not in pretending to be the best, but in becoming someone who is willing to do what that actually requires. And at a certain point, this stops being just about you. It extends beyond your own thoughts, your own habits, your own progress, and begins to affect the space around you. Not in an obvious or forced way, but in something quieter and more consistent. When you carry yourself with that level of certainty and discipline, people notice. Not because you're trying to draw attention to yourself, not because you're performing or trying to impress anyone, but because authenticity stands out in a way that's difficult to ignore. Most people are used to being around hesitation. They're used to second-guessing, inconsistency, and uncertainty, not just in others, but in themselves. So when someone shows up differently, when someone moves with clarity and follows through without constant negotiation, it creates contrast. And that contrast doesn't need to be explained. It's felt. It changes the tone of interactions. It shifts expectations, sometimes without a single word being said. You start to notice that people respond to you differently. Conversations feel more direct. There's less need to justify your decisions or explain your thinking. It's not that people suddenly agree with everything you do, but they recognize something in the way you carry yourself, a sense of direction, a sense of consistency. And that recognition changes how they engage with you. But what matters more is the effect it has beyond those interactions. Because when you consistently operate from a higher standard, it creates a ripple effect. The people around you begin to adjust, even if they don't realize it consciously. Your discipline makes their lack of discipline more visible. Your clarity makes their hesitation more noticeable. Not in a judgmental way, but in a reflective way. It gives them a reference point. And sometimes that reference point is uncomfortable, not for you, but for them, because it challenges their current patterns. It shows them what's possible, not in theory, but in practice. And that kind of exposure can lead to two different responses. Some people will feel inspired. They'll start raising their own standards, pushing themselves a little further, aligning their actions more closely with what they know they're capable of. Others might resist it. They might distance themselves, not because of anything you've done, but because your consistency highlights something they're not ready to face yet. And that's something you have to understand clearly. When you begin to change, not everyone will respond the same way. And that's not something you control. Your responsibility is not to manage how others react. It's to stay aligned with your own standard, because the moment you start adjusting your behavior to make others more comfortable, you begin to lower that standard again. You start compromising the very thing you've been building. There's no emphasis there on convincing others, on explaining yourself, or on seeking approval. It's about embodiment, about living in a way that reflects your values without needing to announce them. And when you do that consistently, influence becomes a byproduct. Not something you chase, not something you try to control, but something that naturally emerges from how you live. People observe your actions, they see the consistency, they see the discipline, and over time, that begins to shape their perception, not just of you, but of what's possible for themselves. This is what real confidence looks like. It doesn't dominate the room. It doesn't try to overpower or outshine others. It elevates. It creates space for clarity, for focus, for higher standards. It leads by example rather than by force. And that kind of presence has a lasting effect because it's not based on performance, it's based on alignment. You're not trying to be better than anyone else. That's not the goal. The goal is to be fully aligned with your own potential, and when you do that, the comparison fades. You're not measuring yourself against others anymore. You're not competing in the way most people think of competition. You're focused on your own standard, your own growth, your own consistency. And that focus creates a kind of stability that others can feel. It removes unnecessary tension. It simplifies your interactions. You're not trying to prove anything, so there's no pressure to perform. You're just operating in a way that reflects who you've decided to be. And that authenticity is what makes the difference. Over time, that presence becomes part of your environment. It influences the spaces you're in, the conversations you have, the expectations that form around you. Not because you're controlling those things, but because your consistency sets a tone. And that tone carries through everything you do. It's a quiet kind of influence, but it's powerful, because it doesn't rely on words. It doesn't rely on persuasion. It comes from action, from repetition, from alignment, and that makes it sustainable. It doesn't fade when attention shifts or when circumstances change. It remains, because it's rooted in who you are, not in what you're trying to project. And in that way, what started as a personal decision becomes something larger, not because you intended it to, but because that's the nature of consistent action. It extends beyond you, it shapes the environment around you, and it gives others a glimpse of what it looks like to live with intention. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. Of course, there will be moments where things don't go your way. That part is unavoidable. No matter how disciplined you become, no matter how aligned you are with your standards, there will be outcomes you didn't expect. Efforts that don't pay off immediately, situations that don't unfold the way you planned. And in those moments, something important is tested. Not your ability, not your potential, but your identity. Because failure has a way of pulling people back into old patterns, back into doubt, back into questioning everything they've been building. The difference is not in whether failure happens, it's in how it's interpreted. Most people attach failure directly to who they are. They don't just see it as something that happened, they see it as something that defines them. A mistake becomes a reflection of their capability. A setback becomes a judgment on their worth. And once that connection is made, everything shifts. Confidence drops. Hesitation returns. The standard they were trying to hold begins to weaken, not because it was unrealistic, but because it wasn't yet stable enough to withstand pressure. But when you operate from a different identity, the meaning of failure changes completely. It stops being something personal, it becomes information, feedback, a signal that something needs to be adjusted, refined, or improved. And that shift is critical because it allows you to stay consistent even when results don't match your expectations. You don't step out of your standard just because the outcome wasn't ideal. You stay aligned and you adapt. This is where acting as if you are the best becomes more than just a mindset. It becomes a stabilizing force. Because when your identity is rooted in how you show up rather than in what happens externally, failure loses its ability to disrupt you. It still matters. You still care about the outcome. But it doesn't redefine you. It doesn't pull you back into uncertainty. It becomes part of the process, not a contradiction of it. There's a level of resilience that comes from that. Not the kind that ignores failure or pretends it doesn't matter, but the kind that absorbs it without collapsing. You're able to look at what went wrong without turning it into a judgment about yourself. You can take responsibility without taking on unnecessary weight, and that clarity allows you to move forward more effectively because you're not carrying doubt into the next attempt. This perspective has been central to Stoic thinking for a long time. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." There's something powerful in that idea, but it only works if you stay consistent in who you are. If every obstacle causes you to step back into doubt, then the obstacle remains a barrier. But if you stay aligned with your standard, if you continue acting in accordance with the identity you've chosen, then the obstacle becomes part of your development. And that's where most people break the pattern. They don't fail because the obstacle is too great. They fail because they allow the obstacle to change how they see themselves. They step out of their identity in the moment it's needed most. They abandon the standard they set because the outcome didn't match their expectation. And in doing that, they reset their progress. But when you refuse to do that, when you decide that your identity is not negotiable based on results, everything changes. You become consistent across different conditions. Success doesn't inflate you. Failure doesn't deflate you. Both become part of the same process. And that consistency builds something deeper than confidence. It builds stability. You begin to trust yourself, not because everything goes your way, but because you know how you'll respond when it doesn't. That trust removes a lot of fear, not because you expect things to be easy, but because you know you won't fall apart when they're not. And that knowledge gives you the ability to take on challenges without hesitation, to push further without holding back. Over time, failure stops feeling like something to avoid and starts feeling like something to use. You don't seek it out, but you don't fear it either. You understand its role. You see how it contributes to your growth, how it sharpens your thinking, how it reveals areas that need attention. And because you're not attaching it to your identity, you can engage with it objectively. This doesn't mean you become indifferent. You still care about progress, you still aim for better outcomes, but your sense of self is no longer tied to each individual result. It's tied to your consistency, to your discipline, to your ability to stay aligned regardless of what happens externally. And that creates a different kind of momentum, one that isn't disrupted by temporary setbacks, one that continues forward, adjusting as needed, but never stopping, because the focus is no longer on avoiding failure. It's on maintaining alignment, on continuing to act in a way that reflects your standard, even when it's challenged. That's what allows the idea to work in practice, not just as a concept, but as a way of operating. The obstacle becomes part of the path because you don't step away from it. You move through it, you use it, you grow from it, and in doing so, you reinforce the identity you've been building all along, not based on outcomes, but based on action. So it all comes back to something simple, but not easy. Not what you want to achieve, not where you want to be 6 months from now, or a year from now, or at some undefined point in the future. It comes back to who you are deciding to be right now, in this moment, without delay, without negotiation. Because everything you've been building toward, every shift in mindset, every adjustment in behavior, it all depends on that one decision. Not a loud decision, not something you announce, a quiet one, internal, but absolute. Most people keep their focus on outcomes. They think in terms of results, goals, milestones, and there's nothing wrong with that on the surface. But the problem is that outcomes are always delayed. They exist somewhere ahead, somewhere you haven't reached yet. And when your focus stays there, your sense of progress becomes tied to something you can't fully control. You start measuring yourself based on what hasn't happened yet, instead of how you're showing up right now. And that creates a constant feeling of being behind, even when you're moving forward. Shifting that focus changes everything, because when you stop asking where you'll end up and start asking who you're being in the present, your attention becomes immediate. It becomes actionable. You're no longer waiting for some future version of yourself to arrive. You're building that version through the choices you make in real time. And those choices, repeated consistently, begin to shape something deeper than results. They shape identity. That's why the decision matters so much. Not because it instantly transforms everything, but because it sets the direction. It defines the standard. Once that decision is made, your actions begin to align with it. You don't wait for confidence to show up before you act. You embody it through your behavior. You don't wait for validation to confirm your direction. You operate without it, because your standard is internal, not external. At first, that can feel uncertain. There's no immediate feedback, no guarantee that what you're doing will produce the results you expect, and that's where most people hesitate. They want reassurance. They want confirmation that they're on the right path, but that need for confirmation is what keeps them dependent on external signals. It keeps them reactive, and as long as they stay in that state, their progress remains inconsistent. But when you move past that, when you decide that your actions will be guided by your standard rather than by your feelings or external feedback, something stabilizes. You're no longer adjusting your behavior based on every small outcome. You stay consistent. You keep showing up the same way, regardless of how things unfold in the short term. And over time, that consistency builds something solid. You start to notice that your actions don't fluctuate as much. You're not as affected by temporary setbacks or moments of uncertainty. You stay aligned, not perfectly, but reliably. And that reliability becomes your foundation. It gives you something to build on, something that doesn't shift every time circumstances change. There's a kind of freedom in that. Not the kind that comes from having no structure, but the kind that comes from having clarity. You know how you're going to show up. You know the standard you're holding yourself to. And because of that, you don't have to constantly question your direction. You don't have to reevaluate yourself after every outcome. You move forward with a sense of stability that most people never develop. This idea has been present in philosophy for a long time, even if it's often misunderstood in practice. Socrates once expressed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and at its core, that idea is about awareness, about being intentional in how you live, in how you think, in how you act, because without that awareness, you drift. You follow patterns without questioning them. You react instead of choosing. But when you examine your life, when you become aware of who you're being in each moment, you gain the ability to change it. And that brings everything back to the present, not as a concept, but as a practice. Who you are right now is not fixed. It's being shaped continuously by what you do, by how you respond, by the standards you choose to uphold. And once you recognize that, the idea of waiting starts to lose its appeal. There's nothing to wait for. The process is already happening. So instead of delaying, instead of holding back until something feels right, you begin to act in alignment with the version of yourself you've decided to be. Not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but consistently. And that consistency over time removes the gap between intention and reality. Because the more you act in alignment with that identity, the less it feels like an act. It becomes natural. It becomes automatic. The decisions you once had to think about become part of how you operate. The behaviors you once had to force become your default. And at that point, something shifts in a way that doesn't need to be explained. There's no longer a separation between who you are and who you're trying to become. In the end, this was never about becoming someone else. It was about returning to a version of yourself that was always there, buried under hesitation, doubt, and waiting. And now that you've seen it clearly, you can't unsee it. The only thing left is to live it, to move with it, to carry that standard into every decision, every action, every moment that follows. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. If you're ready to keep building that mindset and go even deeper, take the next step and watch one of the videos on your screen.